Rima, how do you see it? I mean, that is an interesting distinction, isn't it? Because I know from Andrew's, the title of Andrew's book and the contents of the book, The Ordinary President of Donald J. Trump, he's actually been quite, in some ways, in the mainstream of Republican politics. You know, you cut taxes, you play a lot of golf, that kind of thing. It's the optics which may put people off. So in that sense, Rima, do you think this is a referendum on the Trump presidency?
Suppose yes. Look, as an immigrant who's lived in the US for about 20 years, it's been interesting to watch what Trump says and what he does. And then as I think Bart actually put it quite well, that it is about the optics. It is about how he delivers things. And for me, watching the US public, I think they like it because it's simple. For me, I look at it and say, well, it doesn't make any sense. And it's a lot of rhetoric against immigrants, against human rights, against climate change. So, and I don't want to make the distinction between, you know, educated versus non-educated, but it does come down to that. I think there's the people who vote for him really feel like he speaks my language, and then we can have a whole debate on who these people are and whether we should question their intelligence and integrity.
That also is a very interesting point. Amanda, how do you see it? I mean, you could say, to pick up Rima's point, you couldn't get a more simple political program than Make America Great Again. You stick it on a hat, it sounds like a great idea. Whereas Hillary Clinton, at least 4 years ago, had stacks of policy papers about everything, but didn't have even half a sentence that you could quote, which kind of summed her up. So in that sense, Donald Trump struck a chord in 2016, and he may strike a chord in 2020.
That's right. I mean, I think he does have a very simple message, and it certainly does resonate with some people. The problem now comes in 4 years later when he's saying we still need to make America great again. In the sort of famous question of, are you better off now than you were 4 years ago? I think most Americans have a resounding answer of no. And that's something that and I would also, I have to say, disagree with Bart on the question that Trump actually has accomplished anything over the last 4 years. I mean, he wrote out an excellent economy that the Biden, Trump, Obama Biden presidency put into place, and that was, he was coasting on that. And that's something that then, then was holding strong, right? But that was not anything that his administration had done. He just hadn't managed to destroy it yet. So I would respectfully disagree with Bart on that point. The judicial appointments are something that, along with the president's allies in the Senate, Mitch McConnell blocked Obama's judicial appointments, including one to the Supreme Court, allowing Trump to then fill, indeed, a number of judicial appointments. And that's something that the majority of those are white, 3/4 of them are men. And that is something that I'm sure you'll get to it, Gavin, but this idea of court packing has indeed been happening over the last 4 years.
Indeed, I know Bart wants to come in, but we'll come back to you, Bart. But Andrew, the tone of your book is, I think I've summed it up, tried to sum it up in a sentence, which is, he may look like the oddest president you have ever seen, but actually quite a few of the things he's done have been in the mainstream of Republican politics, on the Republican agenda for years. And in that sense, he's achieved pretty much what some Republicans wanted him to do.
Yeah, I mean, ordinary in two senses. One, he hasn't achieved very much, but that's normal for presidents. You know, they are constrained by the separation of powers, checks and balances, potentially divided government. So it's quite ordinary not to achieve very much. Where Trump has had achievements, as you said, these are down the line Republican achievements, you know, cutting taxes, pulling back on environmental legislation, appointing conservatives to the Supreme Court. There's nothing out of the ordinary there for this presidency. You know, look at what he does rather than look at what he says. He is the most extraordinary president. You know, he is like no other president in American history. But the record is relatively ordinary. And in fact, we connect the two. One of the reasons why his presidency has been ordinary is in part because he is so extraordinary in the way he approaches politics. So when he's had opportunities to lead, when he's had opportunities for great success, he basically ruined it himself through his incompetence, through his chaos, through his messaging. So, you know, he, in some ways, he's his own worst enemy.
But in that sense, Andrew, just to pick up that point, I want to go to Bart on it. I mean, you know, it was the economy stupid. That was what Clinton rode to power on. Amanda's question was, are Americans better off than they were 4 years ago? And I was actually talking to Danny Blanchflower, a British economist who's at Dartmouth. I was talking to him earlier today. He sent me a paper they've just done on the despair and misery index. And the people who are most at risk of suicide, opioid addiction, alcoholism are 48-year-old white Americans without a college degree. And he said that's the Trump base. I mean, so are the people that voted for Trump 4 years ago, do you think, better off than they were 4 years ago?
No, I don't think they are, but I don't think he ever really represented their interests. You know, he's cutting taxes for billionaires. He's reducing taxes for corporations. He's not looking after middle America. He's not looking after ordinary Americans. In fact, it's almost like a great confidence trick that many people believe he's looking after their interests, but the record does not show it. There's no evidence in the record that Trump is looking after ordinary Americans. What's absolutely shocking is that life expectancy for white men is declining in the United States. It is incredible. This president might claim to be on the side of ordinary Americans, but the record just does not show it.
Bart, you've been sitting there very patiently. Go ahead.
Thank you. Yes, I wanted to go to that central question on the economy and whether Americans feel they're better off than they were 4 years ago. And I was interested in Amanda's point that the question was asked by Gallup this year, and they found that 56% of Americans actually said, yes, they are better off than they were 4 years ago. And then with education as well, there is this kind of myth that Trump's supporters are these kind of cavemen from the caves of Michigan or wherever that have no degree and, you know, are from manufacturing jobs and listen to Bruce Springsteen. But if you look at the one demographic that had the largest increase in approval of President Trump during the last 4 years, it's actually Latino voters who have a college degree. And that matters because in Florida, college degree Latinos make up 24% of the population. So this is going to have a big consequence on a lot of the media narratives that are out here right now and led commentators, academics, and politicians to believe that Trump would lose in 2016. I think this bubble narrative about a lack of performance, about the economy, is approaching, and it's going to burst. So I would respectfully argue that when you add 10,000 to the Dow Jones, from the day he was elected, not from the day of his inauguration, but from the day of his election, the markets and investors and American workers who have seen a real-time increase in wages over the same period would disagree.
Rima, where do you stand on this? Because in some ways, looking certainly compared to Britain, and despite COVID, the United States economy doesn't seem to be doing too badly, although we can argue about who's benefiting. And I've just, a question's just come in from Tim Vamplew. It's about the ordinary presidency of President Trump. He says, surely there's nothing ordinary about, for example, the quote, Muslim travel ban. So there were some things which he tried to do. There wasn't anything ordinary about, you know, the overtures to North Korea either. He's tried to do some things which are pretty odd. Maybe Rima first, and then bring in Andrew and Amanda.
Sure. So I sit and I work in financial markets, and I think no president should ever take credit for a good or a bad market. The markets are designed to you know, take in all kinds of sentiment from everybody, and that is what they do. If we believe that markets are perfect and they balance out, so when Trump says, you know, the Dow Jones is up, it's meaningless because the Dow Jones is reacting to the fact that corporations have more money today that they're going to give back to investors. Because yes, Trump slashed the corporate tax rate, but that's not going back into the economy. That's not actually helping infrastructure. It's going back into shareholders' pockets. My company is a great example of that. We've done it too. So the markets react to lots of different factors. Markets don't like change. So I think if Trump is reelected and the markets go up, he's going to take credit for it. But that's simply a fact that markets like stability. And they may react for a few days if Biden becomes president. I think the other thing that we need to consider is that there's a lot of things, and I know we're going to talk about climate change at some point, but climate change is one of those things that Trump is so against. And The markets will not react very well to that because environment, social governance factors are starting to come in, and every investor is saying, where is our money going? So the markets will do what the markets eventually do, which they go through a boom and bust cycle. And I don't think any president can ever take credit for it.
Andrew, you wanted to come in too. I think everybody wants to come into this, but he's not been that ordinary in some of the things he's done, although many of them have, people would say, have been negative in the sense that we don't want to be associated with the Paris Accords. We don't want to be associated with the World Health Organization. But you could say that is also in Republican history, couldn't you? Although the Muslim travel ban or the attempts at that was something kind of extraordinary.
Absolutely, I agree in their attempt, and they failed. I mean, they were struck down by the Supreme Court. So again, it's, don't look at what he says, look at what he's done. And there isn't a Muslim travel ban. It didn't come to fruition. It was a chaotic effort to implement it, but it was ultimately struck down by the Supreme Court. So if it had gone through, I would completely agree and say, yeah, that's not ordinary. But it didn't go through. It was struck down. It was one of those, it was smoke and roasting. On the economy, lots of discussion here about the economy. I mean, that was Trump's strongest card before COVID. There's no question about it. I mean, I agree with Rima that, presidents perhaps shouldn't take credit, but they do. And the social science shows us that when the economy is humming along, presidents usually win re-election. I mean, despite everything, that was his strongest card. COVID comes along, the American economy shuts down, unemployment rockets, borrowing rockets. The economy is not going to win Trump this election now. But it could have done, because if he'd responded to the COVID crisis in a less chaotic, in a more focused and successful manner, the American economy would now be getting going again. It would be starting to hum again in a way that may have given him a better chance of winning election. So it's his poor response to COVID-19 which is disabling the economy from getting back on its feet. And ultimately, I think will be the thing that kills it in this election. It would have been his trump card. But he's lost it now because of his reaction to the COVID crisis.
Amanda, I was tempted to say when Andrew was talking there that Trump wouldn't be the first president or the first British prime minister who takes credit for when the stock market is going well, and when it's going badly, it's, quote, world economic factors, sadly. So, I mean, where do you see this? And where we've also another question from Laura Skillen saying, what does the economic statistics have to do with the economic status and situation of regular Americans, the ordinary people of America?
Yeah. Absolutely, and Laura has absolutely the right point there, because the thing is that Rima was correct that a good stock market puts money back into the pockets of investors, but 87% of stocks are owned by 10% of American households, and so that's where this conversation of a K-shaped recovery has come in. That for the very wealthy, absolutely, that Jeff Bezos has gotten richer than ever, Zuckerberg, and I sure do wish I had bought Zoom shares back in March. So I mean, absolutely. I understand that furniture businesses, IKEA is doing very well. All sorts of people at home, they're doing home improvement. These types of industries, I think, are doing very, very well. But for ordinary Americans we have never seen unemployment like this since the Great Depression. And that's something that 56% Indeed Gallup polls in mid-September showed 56% of Americans saying they're doing better off. That's great. But I wonder, I would have to look at this data a little bit more carefully, because I really would have some questions about that. In terms of the so-called Muslim ban, no, as such, it did not go through. But Trump, under support of his advisor, Stephen Miller, has really managed to put through a great many strongly anti-immigrant measures that recently, in the middle of the night, the refugee resettlement cap was put forward. It's 15,000. It is the lowest it's ever been. And that's something that from the mid-1970s, the United States has been a strong refugee resettlement country, along with Australia, New Zealand, and Canada. And that's something that under this administration is coming to a screeching halt. Students have been cut down. Any number of visa categories have been limited. There are the USCIS. People have just been laid off, furloughed, so that even if technically you can apply for a visa, in all reality, it takes so long for that visa to be processed, it might as well have been blocked. So there's a lot of things like that really have amounted very much. So USCIS took out of its description, we are a country of immigrants. They removed that sentence a couple of years ago. So there's a lot of things that even though the courts were able to ban that as such, that's really very, very much still a factor.
I wondered if we could switch a little bit to some of the key issues. And one, the most obvious one, Bart, is COVID itself. I mean, whether the handling of it has been competent, incompetent, poor, and also a bigger issue, actually, which is about healthcare. Does it raise pretty profound questions about what the role of government is in a global pandemic? And the United States has been found wanting. What do you make of COVID as an issue, Bart?
Well, I think COVID has caught governments across the world off guard. Certainly, the current administration found the strategic reserves of PPE equipment were depleted and left in a pretty shambolic state. America's affairs are also complicated, I suppose, because of the federal nature of government. States have different strategies, and as we found in the UK with devolution, this causes inconsistencies. Where I am in Chicago, if you come from a high-risk state, you have to be in quarantine for 2 weeks. Of course, the city of Chicago has no way of enforcing that, and they don't have any rules for people coming from abroad. So as far as they're concerned, the city of Chicago, the world is America, and that's it. This is a vast problem that really, kind of like the economy, perhaps you're arguing, is very hard for one person or an administration to control. I think it's a trump card for the Trump administration that they had put a travel ban on passengers from China. And I think Joe Biden certainly hasn't really properly addressed the fact that, at the same time that the Trump administration was trying to restrict travel, they were welcoming people and saying we should hold parties in Chinatown, and that's a travel ban from China is xenophobic. So again, this is one of these sort of media narratives that plays very well in, say, London, New York, LA. But as soon as you leave these sort of metropolitan centers, people are saying, well, there are about 500,000 new manufacturing jobs. The Dow's at a record high. 56% of people actually feel they're better off than they were 4 years ago. Who exactly is driving this narrative that we're worse off and that the government's to blame?
Rima, what do you make of COVID as an issue? And obviously, the president, like Boris Johnson, suffered and recovered from it, or appears to have recovered from it. So does that play a part? Is there a sympathy vote, or is there alternatively, the optics of somebody who essentially seemed to deny the seriousness of the thing, rather like Bolsonaro in Brazil, is now confronted with how serious it is? There's been so many people who've died.
Look, I think the Scots said it best. Trump really is a weapons grade plum, and him denying, not acknowledging, delaying COVID has what's resulted in us being here. I think Andrew said it quite well, that Trump had a perfect opportunity not to put us in this position, or any of the governments. And and I will say it's Boris Johnson, it's Bolsonaro, it's look at India, look at Pakistan. But then you look at some other countries that, yes, they may be smaller in size, but they've managed to control this thing. So I think from day one, there was a lot of denying, there's a lot of confusion about what this virus is, where is it coming from, and how best can we control it. And I think Trump is too busy drumming up his own imagery and brand to step back and say, wait, there's a problem. I really need to do something about the country to protect the people. And he failed us on that front. He really, really failed us on that front. So Bart's in Illinois, I'm in Massachusetts. I don't listen to Trump. I listen to my governor and the mayor of Boston, because I think they're doing a fabulous job, because really they're the ones who are going to give me any direction. And I think that this is one where even the people who love him are really going to step back and say, look, you've killed an awful lot of people. 200,000 people are dead in this country. And could you have done something different had you just focused on it and left it to the experts? And that chaos is I mean, it's demoralizing. And we're we're supposed to be the first world country leading by example, and we're way, way behind.
Andrew, how do you see it? Because I mean, to sort of emphasize Bart's point, no government, well, very few governments, New Zealand may be an example of one that's done very well, but lots of governments, the French government, the German government, the Czech government, the British government, have all said, you know, maybe we're not doing it quite right, maybe we have to think. So it's obviously not easy. Is there something about Trump, because of the way in which he handled it, because of some of the glib statements he made about disinfectant and all that sort of stuff? Does that play with voters, or is that just Trump being Trump?
No, I think it does play in. I mean, you know, Americans look to the president for leadership during times of crisis. You know, they did that. They've done that ever since Franklin Roosevelt addressed the Great Depression in the 1930s. You know, recently, we saw the American public looking to George W. Bush for protection after 9/11, and he succeeded in doing that. He's given the image of success, and yet he ultimately failed with Hurricane Katrina, and his presidency began to unravel from that moment. When presidents are seen, the reality doesn't matter on this one, but presidents are not seen to be in control and not seen to be protecting the American people, they will suffer for that. You know, Bart talked about, you know, repeated the administration line that, you know, we've shut down China. Well, as far as I understand it, America was the 46th country to ban travel from China. So it wasn't exactly leading the pack there. You know, Trump, his messaging on it has been absolutely awful. I mean, it's beyond belief how poor his messaging is. It's Twitch's data. I mean, on masks, you know, on the injecting the bleach, on the light. I mean, this is just an extraordinary response. Americans expect, I think, better. And I think, frankly, they deserve better from their president. It's still incredible to me that there is no real federal plan to address the coronavirus crisis. Trump has basically said, it's on the states, let the states. And at the same time he said it's on the states, he then undermines the states at every turn, trying to set Republican and Democrat states against each other. I mean, it is an extraordinarily incoherent response for which now he is being punished.
Amanda, as we've been talking there, Tristan Jones has just sent, it's not so much a question, more a kind of observation. I worked at a school in rural America when the school shut down for COVID. Everyone watched Trump's Oval Office address. No one, Republican or Democrat, felt comforted. There was clearly no plan. Do we expect people really to forget that experience? So that's part of it. I just wondered if the wider story is also, you know, this is a president who got some of the best healthcare in the world when he was sick. If you're sitting at home in America and wondering if you're going to lose whatever Obamacare does for you, or it's not as good, maybe you might be resentful.
I think that's so. I mean, because that's the big difference between the United States and other developed countries, is that the United States does not have healthcare for every single person in this country. There are estimates, there's a study out now estimating that up to 14 million people might have lost their health insurance, because in the United States, health insurance is linked to your employment. So if you lose your job, you're very likely to lose your health insurance also. And of course, during the pandemic, millions of people have lost jobs and have lost health insurance. And that, I think, is one of the factors that comes into the great loss of life in the United States, is that in Belgium, the numbers are very bad in Belgium right now, but people are not afraid to go to the doctor or to call the doctor if they feel sick, because they know they have health insurance. And that's something that in the United States, even pre-COVID, people are afraid to go to the doctor because they realize it might bankrupt them. Bankruptcies because of medical reasons, that's the #1 reason for bankruptcies, individual bankruptcies in the United States. That's ridiculous. And that's something that absolutely, especially in rural America, where healthcare is not all that easily readily available, people will remember this, I think. And that's something that I know we'll get onto it in a bit, but this question of voting and how to vote, that's a really, really big issue, because people don't forget that. They don't forget that the president had access to excellent health care at the same time that he is actively trying to undermine Obamacare, the Affordable Care Act. He is actively trying to do that while he and members of the Senate enjoy much better, very robust health care.
Rima, I'm conscious that we've been talking for half an hour and we haven't mentioned the B word yet, Biden. He's apparently also running. So, I mean, my point really is Trump is so interesting in various ways. is Biden just the not Trump candidate? So that might be good for him. Or is there something, you know, is he too old, some people say? Or is there something about Biden's message which connects with voters in a more positive way that will ensure he gets elected? What do you think, Rima?
I think at the moment, because everything is so chaotic, we do look up to a leader, and that many times is the president. And Biden is very calming in a way. You know, I won't say he's got a perfect message, and he's probably hasn't figured out every aspect of his policy. And yes, even a Democrat voter like me, it concerns me that he's a bit old. But at the same time, he has somebody who has a lot of experience in dealing with crises such as what we have now. He has experience in running a government, and most important, there's, you know, we haven't talked much about the disruption that Trump's first presidency and his second presidency will cause to foreign policy. That's something that I think Biden is a master at, and we need that. We don't need to be make America great again. America's fine. You know, whether it's great or not, I'll leave that for everybody else, but the country's okay. There's nothing really that wrong with it. So we don't need to make it anything again. But what we do need is more cohesiveness across the globe. And I think a Biden presidency offers that, and it offers it on many platforms, national and international. And I think that's where we are right now.
Bart, I mean, I suggested at the start of our conversation that Biden might represent a return to the kind of multilateralism of, you know, trying to do something about Iran in a different way that Trump rejects, trying to do something about climate change that Trump rejects, trying to do something about COVID that Trump rejects. And so actually being not Trump might be just good enough to get him elected. Bart?
I think not being Trump is perhaps enough for him to get elected. But I would challenge again this idea that Trump's foreign policy has been some way disastrous. I think many Americans like the fact that we haven't, perhaps the first president for a decade or a decade and a half that hasn't got involved in a foreign conflict and has remained isolationist. Apart from at the very beginning of his term when he fired, I think, 53 cruise missiles at an airstrip in Syria, we saw staggering restraint when Iran launched missiles at American bases, and everyone thought World War III was about to kick off. And I think we also saw with NATO, so globalist organizations, we saw the Trump presidency successfully lobby many members to meet their 2% defense commitments. So again, you have this sort of narrative that the Biden administration would be successful with foreign policy when we've seen Biden in the past make a lot of wrong calls, like suggesting that they didn't go in for the kill after Osama bin Laden, and also, of course, his support for the Iraq War from the very beginning. So, you know, there are again these kind of narratives that kind of set academics and circles of discussion off.
But just, you know, I remember the day that Mr. Trump went into the Walter Reed Hospital, there was someone from the administration on BBC Radio who was saying, don't worry, the leader of the free world will be back soon. And I wondered, do you think anybody actually sees him as the leader of the free world?
I do think so, especially Americans, or some quarters of America anyway. But I don't think I think America is increasingly being challenged as a global superpower. Post-Cold War, there was a brief decade and a half where perhaps they could claim to be, the only power in the world. But of course, China's emerging, India, the BRIC countries, and I guess like the Roman Empire, we're finding increased demands on welfare, increased issues with security, and all these sort of things are affecting America's kind of post-colonial empire, a neoliberal empire, if you will.
Amanda, how do you see Mr. Trump and this question of the leader of the free world and multilateralism? I mean, some of the, we all know the kind of isolationist cutoff from multilateral organizations has been part of American culture for certainly a century and probably quite a bit longer. So in that sense, it's not much of a shock to Americans, is it, that they've got a president who doesn't think much of the World Health Organization? for example?
Well, I think it's one thing to critique an organization. I think it's another thing to say falsehoods about them. It's also another thing to withdraw unilaterally. It's one thing to be late paying your dues. It's another thing to say that you will never pay dues again. The other thing is I think whether we view the United States as the only superpower in the world and the president of the United States as a leader of the free world, for better or worse, the United States president is a role model. And that's something that I think President Trump enables other authoritarian leaders, that if the president of the United States is withdrawing from the Paris Climate Agreement, is withdrawing from the WHO, is withdrawing from all of these different multilateral organizations, then that gives other countries sort of the pass, right? They say, well, you know, if the US is doing it, then we can do it too. So I think the United States does have a responsibility. I agree. It's not the only superpower. There are others emerging, and certainly the multilateral world is changing. But I think that's absolutely something that is incredibly dangerous. And with respect to what's going on with relation to the European Union, they're pretty hesitant about reaching out to a Trump administration. And that's something that admittedly at this point, everybody's very much in a wait and see mode. And that's something that under a normal presidency, they would still be carrying on working with the United States. But for the moment, they seem to have put that pretty much on hold until we know what happens on November 3rd or November 10th or thereabouts.
Or sometime, yeah. Well, Andrew, I mean, I was struck when Bart was talking that leadership does demand followership. And if you're the leader of the free world, people have to be following you. And there's not a huge sign. I mean, we just heard from Amanda about the European Union. There's not a huge queue of people saying, yeah, Donald, we'll march in lockstep with you.
Well, I'm actually surprisingly sympathetic to Bart on this one. I thought his analysis was quite astute. I mean, Donald Trump is unbelievably unpopular in Europe. I mean, you know, he couldn't be more unpopular in Europe. But Europe is not representative of the wider world. You know, Trump is actually pretty popular in Eastern Europe, in the old Soviet Union states. He's also fairly popular in the Middle East, with the exception of Palestine, of course. You know, there are areas in the world which are sort of, you know, Trump fans. So it's not all, you know, doom and gloom. Whether he can still claim America as a shining city on a hill, which is a claim that Reagan made in the 1980s, is debatable. I mean, I think America has lost its luster over the years, but was perhaps beginning to before Trump came to office. I mean, people have been talking about American decline for at least a generation, if not two. So to say, oh, it's all imploding on Trump's watch, I think sort of overestimates Trump's impact and underestimates history. You know, there is America is no longer as powerful as it was. But that's not just Trump's doing. You know, the rise of China and other world events have been going on for some time. Globalization, interdependence. You know, the idea that America is by far the world superpower. It's been under contention for quite a long time, and it predates Trump.
Rima, how do you see this? Because it was not even quite a generation ago, people were talking about a unipolar world with the one great superpower and American culture dominating. And even actually the fact that Black Lives Matter, something happened in America, the world still pays great attention to the United States. It touches all of us. So in a sense, whoever the American president is, there will be a leadership role. It's just a question of some people, as Andrew says, like the leadership role that Mr. Trump plays and others don't.
So, you know, I agree with Andrew on this. I think that America is this great nation and free leader. I think we lost some of that status a while back. And that's okay, because this was still a country that was welcoming to many people from all those other countries that were doing so well. So whether that was China or India or Australia or New Zealand, we still remained the country that was attracting the best talent. And I think today, what 2020 has done, if you look at it as a year between Black Lives Matter, between the pandemic and Trump and his rhetoric, is that it's identified everyone and it's amplified everybody. And it's very hard for a Trump administration to hide behind that. So that's why it becomes more chaotic, because, you know, this idea of America is the best, but we don't want anybody else. But we're really not the best, and we probably haven't been for a while. And now you're diminishing our ability to bring in that great talent to at least give us some status. I think that's the sort of really messy part, and whether Trump is the next president or Biden becomes the next president, that is something they have to deal. They both have to deal with this issue of that we are no longer the best. But let's focus on how we can continue to attract the best talent from everywhere, and make this still a very appealing place for people to come and work.
Bart, there's a related issue in foreign policy, which has come in from Ian and Sandwich. Are the Democrats anti-British? And also from Guy Thomas, is Biden anti-British, or is he against Boris as an individual, but will work with the UK? What do you think, Bart?
I don't think Biden's anti-British so much as he's not as much of an Anglophile as Trump is. I think with the Trump presidency, the UK, if it was just being self-interested, has a massive open goal with a trade deal and its role after exiting the European Union. So I do recall Biden saying the Good Friday Agreement has to be respected when it comes to the Internal Markets Act. And I think Nancy Pelosi also made some posturing about the House not passing a trade deal unless that was respected. But I don't see these as particularly anti-British sentiments. It's just it's realism. And the Irish constituency in America, of course, is a very powerful one. But this is just realpolitik as we see it. So no, I don't think it's a case of Biden being anti-British.
Do any of you, Andrew or Amanda, do you think there's an anti-British streak there, or is it? But let me put it this way, Amanda. It will be difficult, I would suggest to you, for the trade negotiations between a Boris Johnson-led government and a Biden government, particularly depending on what happens in the Senate, because if the Senate were to fall into Democrats' hands, it will be very difficult for Boris Johnson, it seems to me anyway, to get the kind of trade deal through the Senate that he thinks he would like.
I think that might be the case, and that's something that I think really that is also going to depend on the conditions under which the UK does leave the European Union, and what is the relationship between those three players, then the US, the UK, and the EU, and that's something that I think very well could be difficult for them to get through. What is it that they're able to agree on? What type of policies? There are a number of different. Food safety is one of the very big issues on which the UK and the US have big differences, and that's certainly something that would have to be taken into account. But we'll see where that goes. That's an unknown, I think.
Yeah, that is an unknown. Andrew, what, just your thoughts on that? That I mean, Bart was saying it's not anti-British, but essentially the mood will change in Washington, undoubtedly, will it not? Because Boris Johnson thinks he's got a warm relationship with Donald Trump. Whether he's got such a warm relationship with Joe Biden, given some of the comments that he made as a journalist about the Obama presidency, remains to be seen.
Yeah, I mean, look, I agree with Bart. I don't think Biden's anti-British. He's pro-Irish, you know, and in a conflict between Britain and Ireland, his sympathies would be with the Irish. You know, he makes a great play of his Irish heritage. It's very important to him, and so yeah, but he's not anti-British. But if I was Johnson, I think, you know, I'd rather be negotiating a trade deal with the Biden administration than a Trump administration, because the Trump administration, I mean, Bart says Trump's an Anglophile. I don't think so. He's just purely transactional. Trump would play hardball, I think, with Johnson or any British prime minister, in a way that, you know, Biden, because Trump doesn't see the benefits of global trade. He thinks of it as a zero-sum game. You win, therefore I lose. Whereas the Democratic position is more open to the benefits of globalization and global trade, recognizing that, you know, a trade agreement can come out with two winners. So, you know, if I was negotiating a trade agreement, I'd want to negotiate with someone who believes that both sides can win, rather than only believing one side could win, which is Trump's position in this.
Thank you. I wonder if we can go over to BSIS in Brussels now, and Boyan, I wonder if you've got some questions that have come in from your audience there. Can we do that? There you are, Boyan. Hi, good evening to you.
Hi, everyone. So we have a nice and excited crowd over here already with a couple of questions. Would you want to come over? Yes, please. All right, we have one of our master's students asking a question in a second.
Hi, my name's Becky and I'm doing the Masters in Political Strategy and Communications. And my question is this. The journalist Mehdi Hassan was interviewing Elizabeth Newman, who's a former Trump advisor recently. And he asked her, do you believe that Trump is aiding and abetting domestic terrorism? And she said, yes, he's the most dangerous president we've ever had. Do the panelists agree? And if so, how to respond to that?
Right. Rima, what do you think of that? And also his sort of rather odd comments about the Proud Boys, about stand down but stand by. What do you make of that? Aiding and abetting domestic terrorism.
I feel like those are very legal terms. So part of me wants to say yes, but maybe that's so that's strong. But I will say this. I think Trump, his first and his second presidency have all been about, it's always been about him, his brand, his business. And his campaign has done a fabulous job of exploiting white racial prejudices. And the result of that is the Proud Boys and all these other militia groups that keep coming out. Because whether it's a backlash to Obama or whether it's the way Trump speaks to them, but they think that they have the authority to come out and harm others with guns, and that's okay. So yes, he does aid and abet them in a way because he makes it easy for them. He makes it, when he doesn't openly come out and say that Proud Boys are people who shouldn't exist or these militias, he's essentially giving them a free path to go and create chaos. And so, yes, and I think that's an issue that doesn't go away even when he goes away. I think it's something we have to really watch that. I'm not saying Antifa becomes the next ISIS, but this is a serious problem in the US that we have to carefully watch.
Bart, maybe just give you one shot at that too, because I was struck, because right at the start of our conversation, you suggested that it's a bit pejorative to see Trump supporters in a particular way. But when you see some of these rather large, white, middle-aged guys with assault rifles that would be used in a military in other countries, they do fit into a certain stereotype, don't they? And Mr. Trump is seen by some people as aiding and abetting their kind of activities.
Well, I think it's a good point. There is a very tempting stereotype when you see some of these sort of extrovert characters and unpleasant groups that are irresistible media targets to associate them with the Trump administration. But I think a lot of that analysis and reporting and coverage is because of a failure to understand the essence of conservatism and individualism in America. I think it was Ayn Rand that said there is no minority as endangered as the individual. And at its core, this new conservative coalition we're seeing with increased support from minority groups is seeing in minorities as individuals and rejecting the idea that races and groups of people are monolithic blocks that need to vote the same way. So we're seeing a splintering of a coalition made up of groups such as union people and minorities, and we're seeing disruption. And this is what disruption looks like. It's just unfortunate we have a president who is terrible with optics and seems to throw paraffin on bonfires when it comes to very sensitive issues, such as the protests we saw in, I think it was Charleston, and other things like that. It's just very unfortunate and inappropriate language that just completely complicates and muddies the water.
Thank you. Boyan, let's try and get a couple more questions in from you. Who's next?
Actually, can I piggyback off of the last question? And this might also give Amanda an opportunity to engage as well. Why does Trump outperform every other modern Republican president when it comes to his support among men of color.
Amanda.
Why does he outperform everyone else among men of color? I mean, that's certainly something that Bart referred to the 2017 Charlottesville protests or rallies, anti-Semitic rallies, and when he said there are very fine people on both sides. And that's something that I think there is that this question of sort of whether people vote or identify as a member of a group or a member or as an individual, that Gretchen Whitmer, that there was a plot to kidnap the Michigan governor, and shortly after that, Trump led a rally in chanting "Lock her up," I think is incredibly problematic, and I think does amount to aiding and abetting domestic terrorism. And I think that's something that that speaking about identities is simply obscures that, and that is a very real problem. That the FBI discovered a plot to kidnap a sitting governor. And the president did not condemn that. He did not have anything to say on that other than to say, lock her up. That's problematic.
Boyan, let's try for another couple of questions from you and your colleagues.
All right, we have a question from one of our PhD students. Come on.
Hi, everybody. I'm Rada Mahajar. I'm a PhD student here. My first question is to Amanda. What the immigration policy under the Biden administration would look like? And my second question is more open to the panel. What would his foreign policy, I mean Biden's foreign policy as far as the Middle East would look like? So thank you.
Amanda first.
Thanks for the question, Rita. I think certainly that we saw one of the last things that President Obama did while he was in office was to hold the first international level discussion on migration and refugees. That had not been done before. The New York Declaration on migration and on refugees that was in the closing days of his presidency would have led to considerably more resettled refugees to the United States, would have led to agreements around the world. And that's something I think that we can see come back in a Biden administration. Declaration of Human Rights says that everyone has a right to leave their country. There is no corresponding right to enter anywhere else. And that's something that I think countries really do need to step up. There is more migration these days. Climate change is a factor in that. And that's something that countries do need to come to international agreements on. And that's something that a Biden administration, I think, would lead on.
Well, I'm speaking to you about less than half a kilometre from the beach in Kent, and I can tell you that's something we all have to think about quite a bit. Andrew, did you want to pick up on that second question there about foreign policy? Biden.
The Middle East policy, yeah, I mean, sure. I don't think there would be a dramatic change from the Obama presidency. I think if you want to look, what will the Biden presidency look like, go back and look at the Obama presidency. I think that's the best guide, I think, in terms of foreign policy and in terms of domestic policy as well. Specifically on the Middle East, you asked about, I mean, I think we would see a Biden president being a little bit less pro-Israel. I think it would still be strongly pro-Israel, but maybe just a little less strong, maybe a little bit more pro-Palestine, but not dramatically. A little bit less pro-Saudi Arabia, but again, not much. I don't think we're going to see much movement in the Middle East with a Biden presidency, to be honest.
Thank you. Boyan, again.
All right, so we've had a question from our Dean for Europe, Professor Jeremy Corrett. I can just tell you what it was. Will God decide this election?
Right. Who would like that one? Rima.
We could start another controversy here to say which God? Is it God, Allah, Vishnu? I mean, I think that I fear that Trump, may not accept that he loses, and this becomes one of those Bush and Gore situations where it goes down to the courthouse. But again, this is not a problem that Trump has created. This is a problem, it's an age-old problem in this country where for a Democratic country that's supposed to be the free leader of the world, we make voting so difficult for individuals that, you know, I don't blame Trump sometimes when he says, do we have free and fair elections? So yeah, I don't know what's going to happen. And there's a part of me that thinks that he might actually be relieved that he's not president, and he might just say thank you and goodbye. And I've done what I've needed to keep the Trump image and brand alive, and I'm going to go back and make money and create trouble elsewhere.
There's all kinds of parts to that question, isn't there, Andrew? One is, I mean, I've talked to people who are Christians and who say, yeah, well, we forgive Trump all the other stuff, his attitude to women, all that stuff, but he will get a Supreme Court which will overturn Roe versus Wade, and he will do certain things that appeal to evangelical Christians. So in that sense, maybe God will play a role in swinging it in some places.
Yeah, it was a great question. It's one of those questions that makes you think, what's the question? And actually, the more I'm thinking about it, the more complicated I realize the question is. And there's lots of really interesting layers to it. But I guess, you know, the key aspect here is, you know, will the evangelical vote, the white evangelical vote, swing it for Trump? My suspicion is no, it won't. You know, he's got the support of 85%, maybe even that, yeah, about there, of white evangelicals, but it's not enough to win him the election. They're not enough evangelicals to get him back into the White House. What Trump needs to do, and what he consistently fails to do, is think about the moderates in the center of the political system. He's got the evangelicals, he's got the conservative vote. He doesn't need to keep going after that vote. What he needs to think about is, how do I get another 5 percentage points of this electorate? He needs to move to the center, and it's remarkable that he's consistently failed to do that in any way whatsoever. You know, he just keeps, what he's got is a base strategy. So what I think Trump's banking his cards on, is that he can turn out more of his core supporters than Biden can. But I just don't think that's going to work, because as we started off this conversation, this is a referendum on Trump. Democrats are coming out in droves. The early voting numbers are through the roof because people are desperate to get this man out of the White House. So yes, he's got the evangelical vote absolutely nailed down, but it's not a big enough constituency to win this election for him. He needs to move to the center, and the more he fails to do that, then his chances are just going out the window.
Amanda, the role of God in all this,
I think it's a great
various
question.
Mysterious ways.
I think it's a great question. No, I mean, I would interpret it more as Andy does, that it really is about the role of a Supreme Court justice who is going to be pro-life. But I will say that one thing that I think the Democrats have been doing over time, and really are being much more effective at, is talking about what it means to be pro-life. I saw an interview the other day. Journalists asked an unmasked white red hat wearing person at a rally, so you are pro-life? And he says, absolutely. And the journalist says, well, why aren't you wearing a mask? And he responds in a moment of perfect irony, I think it should be a personal choice. And so that's something that I think the Democrats really have said, fine. So pro-life also means having health insurance. Pro-life also means protecting people against COVID. And so I think that's something that has, I mean, and I just recently looked at the polls on evangelical voters. It's nudged down just a little bit. So even there, Trump has lost a few percent, not a huge amount, but the needle's nudged down just a little bit in support of white evangelical voters for Trump. And so that's something that, I mean, that really it's going to come down to voter turnout. And as you say, 46 million people have already voted.
I remember, Amanda, having a discussion with a couple of politicians in Georgia, and one said to the other, the trouble with you is you seem to think the right to life ends at birth. And they all went very quiet at that point. Anyway, yeah. I'll come back to Boyan in a second, but just a couple of other questions have come in. Let me put this to Bart, first of all. How will events unfold if a defeated Trump refuses to leave the White House? I mean, do you see that as a possibility? And of course, he would then say, presumably, I've not been defeated. There's something wrong with the voting system. What do you think that's a credible possibility?
Not at all. And it's kind of ironic that it's a common kind of Democrat talking point that he won't accept their election, or he's some kind of existential threat to democracy, when really in American history, or at least in recent modern history, the only party, there's only two, that has really rejected the outcome of an election recently has been the Democrats. Having said, it's important to recognize that, if Trump lost, would you accept the result? When Trump won, we had these sort of conspiracies about Russia making him a puppet. We had the inability of the legislature to pass his very basic cabinet appointments and ambassadors. It took, I think, more than a year to get an ambassador to Britain appointed, just because there was such obstruction. This was a presidency that from the very beginning was frustrated by anti-democratic sentiments and operations at the heart of previous administration. It started off as people saying, well, it's a conspiracy if you say, was Trump frustrated by the Obama administration? But there are now texts, emails, records showing that the Obama administration not only withheld intelligence from the incoming administration, which is unheard of in modern American politics, but they also did a lot of entrapment operations, including General Flynn. So, I don't want to go wandering off into InfoWars territory here with tinfoil hats, but this is an unprecedented time for an administration when it finds itself with being set up with many booby traps and an opposition that says it may not accept results either.
Amanda, do you think there could be trouble along these lines, that it could end up somehow in the Supreme Court who'd have to judge, as they did 20 years ago, whether a manual recount in some areas should continue? I mean, what do you see as the problem there, or is it just a Democrat scare story?
I mean, I think certainly back in 2000, the outcome of that presidential election did end up in the Supreme Court. And that was about the counting of absentee ballots. And ultimately, President Bush won Florida by 537 votes. And those were largely military overseas ballots that I have voted overseas absentee for over 20 years. And that's something that is a well-established part. Overseas Americans won the right to vote in 1976. So people have been voting by absentee ballot for years. Oregon has had its elections completely mail-in for several elections now. But it is certainly true that every year a couple ballots, about 1%, tend to get thrown out because they were mailed after the date, or a signature was illegible, but coming in late is one of the major reasons. So yeah, I think there probably will be a certain amount of litigation around that, unless there is such a resounding victory, either in enough electoral college votes that we don't have to go that route. But if it is a slim margin of victory in one or two states, then yes, I think we probably are going to see that go to courts. The Supreme Court just did give the Democrats shall we say, a win in the state of Pennsylvania, where it was permitted to continue counting ballots that are received up until 3 days after the election. And that's something that is huge. Pennsylvania, as the federal system really does complicate matters, every state has a different way of registering voters, of counting ballots. I can return mine by email to Massachusetts, but that's something that not every state does. So yes, it's going to be complicated unless we have a very clear Biden win.
Thank you. Let's go back to Boyan for some more thoughts in Brussels BSIS.
All right, so a question maybe for Andrew primarily. I was wondering, should Biden win, and this is a big if, what are your views about who or what will ideologically be determining his agenda? Because obviously a lot of his support now is coming from disaffected Trump voters, right? Seniors, some non-college educated men and college educated women. I almost said disinfected Trump voters. but obviously within the Democratic Party, things have moved to the left quite a bit, especially over the past couple of years. So who do you think will be prevailing in the sort of Biden presidency should it come about?
Andrew?
Biden is a centrist. He's a pragmatist. and he'll run his administration as one. You know, he won't staff it with, you know, Bernie Sanders or people of that ilk. You know, this is the Trump and the Republican Party are trying to spin this story that Sanders is in the, well, first of all, he tried to spin the story that that Biden himself was a lefty, but that just doesn't wash. You know, he's got 40 years of experience. You know, the American people know him. They know he's not a lefty. So now the story is, okay, he's in the pockets of the lefties. He's in the pockets of the communists. In fact, I think I've even called Kamala Harris a communist, which, I mean, it's bizarre. It's ludicrous. But, you know, Trump can try and spin these stories, but the American people, I don't think, are buying them, and with good reason. And that's because Biden is a pragmatic centrist, and I think he'll run his administration as a pragmatic centrist. You're absolutely right that there are elements of the Democratic Party which are clearly to the left. You know, we can think of AOC in Congress and a couple of other members of Congress as being out there, but they're not really representative of where the Democratic Party is as a whole at the national level. There's what's called, get a bit technical, there's these things called DW nominate polls, and there's some political scientists who basically track ideological sentiment in Congress by party. And what's happened over the past 20 or, well, since the mid-1970s, is the Republican Party in Congress has moved clearly to the right. It's become much more conservative. Democrats have not really moved at all. Of course, there's some more left-wing and right-wing ones, but on average, they've stayed pretty centrist, pretty steady across time, decade after decade. And Biden is at the heart of that. He's an old school, you know, establishment Democrat. He'll staff his administration with people like him from the center. And, you know, as I said before, my best guess is it'll look a lot like the Obama administration. Obama administration, pragmatic, centrist Democrats.
Boyan, perhaps we could take one more from yourself, and then I've got quite a few coming in here. I'd like to pass on. Go ahead, Boyan.
Actually, I'd like to switch over to Amanda. Going off of that, my previous question, but the left wing of the Democratic Party was quite impactful in shaping the Democratic Party platform over the summer, right? Like late spring and over the summer. Do you agree with Andrew's assessment?
I mean, I think that a President Biden administration would be very aware of the sentiments behind the Black Lives Matters movement, and would really make movements toward making sure that those sentiments are included. That I think he himself is a centrist, and he's not going to, we're not going to see a major shift to the left, but I think we will see more inclusion of more perhaps progressive left-wing elements than we might otherwise have expected.
Thank you. Let me put a couple of questions to the panel now. Bart, this one comes from Simon Kerridge. What happened to the wall?
I think the wall was not funded. By the
Mexicans?
Well, the original plan was that Mexico was going to pay for it. I mean, it was a fantastic marketing ploy. I'm not sure the reality worked out. Last time I checked, about 400 to 600 miles of wall had been built, but it was reconstruction of existing wall. So yeah. So I don't know. I think it's interesting, the whole narrative about immigration. When we have to realize there are about 4 million potential immigrants waiting in line to go through the US immigration system. Most of these people are from Southeast Asia, or a big proportion of them are anyway. Latin America, Southeast Asia, people who want HB1 visas to become computer programmers and such, and they're waiting very patiently in line. So the whole thing about the Trump immigration policy, again, optics, not great. Reality is wait in line, follow the rule of law, and then you can come through the big, beautiful door in the wall. Unfortunately, there's no wall. But if you go back to the State of the Union speech from Clinton in 1995, building a border fence or a protection of any sort, this was a mainstream policy that Democrats and Republicans both agreed on. Unfortunately, again, Trump has been his own worst enemy with this, made it an incendiary issue, and taken something that everybody could agree on, more or less, at least in mainstream politics, and turn it into something that was a dangerous thing to talk about and divisive.
I wonder, Rima, I don't think many people liked all those pictures of kids basically being locked up and separated from their parents. So the optics, as Bart said, whatever you know, obviously countries have to control immigration, control their borders, but the optics were absolutely terrible on this, weren't they?
Absolutely. And I think, again, if Trump and his administration really were trying to stop immigrants from coming in, Mexico is not the problem. I think we get more immigrants coming in from Canada. So, if he wants to build a wall on the northern border, go for it. And, maybe Trudeau will even pay for it. But the reality is that, again, immigrants make this nation. They make every nation better, in my humble opinion. So I think that, any administration, especially Trump's, they could have done a better job of managing it. I don't think a lot of immigrants were coming in under Obama's administration either. But it's the optics and the separation of families and kids is what makes it worse. And we'll never really know. We don't really know what Trump's immigration policy really is because of the optics muddying the situation.
Another question, I think this one's for Andrew actually, from Alexander Stennings. Do you think the Democrats will expand the Supreme Court? It's been mooted, but is it likely?
Oh, well, Biden's just created a commission, hasn't he, to kick it into the long grass because he doesn't want to actually answer that before the election. That's a pretty incendiary issue. He wants to be careful about this, and a commission is a great way to do that, not to answer the question. I think it's something you have to think really long and hard about. The Supreme Court, surprisingly, the 9 members of the court is not constitutionally mandated. It's just been tradition. It's been that way since, I think, 1869. We've had 9 members, but it can change. It needn't be 9. I think it would require an act of Congress to change it. But it can be increased. But I think Biden needs to think really carefully about starting an arms race with the Supreme Court. I mean, the Democratic Party is in trouble in part on the Supreme Court because during the Obama presidency, under Harry Reid's leadership of the Senate, it got rid of the supermajority rule for the appointment of federal judges, excluding the Supreme Court. When the Republicans won control, they just got rid of the supermajority for the Supreme Court as well. And we've seen, two and almost certainly 3 appointments going through under Trump's presidency. So the Democrats sort of started playing with fire back during Harry Reid's leadership of the Senate, and it's come back to burn them. They need to be really careful because the Republicans have an inbuilt institutional advantage in the Senate.
Amanda, there's a question from Ian Matthews. Will it come down to Florida again? And I suppose we could widen it and say, for those of us outside, much as we love America, the system developed in the age of the horse and cart did look pretty shaky 20 years ago, and it may look shaky again. It may have even looked quite shaky 4 years ago when you have somebody who is elected through electoral college votes rather than through the popular mandate. So what do you think? Will it come down to maybe 1 or 2 narrow states like Florida?
I mean, it may well, but what we're seeing this year is that states that have been solidly Republican for a number of elections, like Texas, are actually now toss-up states. So this is something that it might come down to Florida or Pennsylvania. Biden has a solid lead in a number of states right now. And then there are other states that if Texas, for instance, which is going to have something like 8 million more voters than it did last time around, that if Biden wins Texas, for instance, then Florida doesn't really matter. So this year, I think things are going to look a lot different than they did 4 years ago. But it certainly is true that the United States is compared to Europe and the UK is a very young country, but it's a very old democracy. And so that's something that when we think even about things like the Second Amendment and the Supreme Court, as Andy said, that these have been in place for a very, very long time. And it may be time. Vice President Biden said that we need to look at wishful thinking, that we need to look at the court system. It's out of whack, he said, and there is something to that. Do we really want to appoint a 48-year-old judge as a justice of the Supreme Court for a lifetime appointment? That's a very important point. And so that's something that I think a commission, as much as it is kicking it into the long grass, Andy, I think it's also is a wise thing to do. And the Electoral College, 2 states do split their electoral votes, Nebraska and Maine, and that's something that states can decide on their own. But a change in a constitutional amendment to change that would be a lot of work.
Boyan, should we have a last question from BSIS? We've got about 10 minutes left. So if you do one question, and then I'll do a couple of wrap-up questions.
Perfect. Let's go with something that to me sounds hopeful. A question for everyone, I guess. What do you think should be the Biden administration's priority in the first 100 days?
Right. Well, Bart is the obvious person to go to.
I don't know. It feels like asking me, what kind of cheese should the moon be made of if we ever got a Biden administration that's coming in. I think its first priority should be to address Joe Biden's history of racism. I think there are huge issues with race in America, obviously. And you have to remember there are two candidates. Only one of them has a past in supporting segregation. When it came to busing in school children into schools, Joe Biden was an ally, and ABC News has a great article on this, of the segregationists. Joe Biden also has made a number of very bad statements about race. Some of them you might be put down to his state of mind and age. But there is a big movement in voters from the African-American community and the Latin American community going to Trump. So I think, speaking about Florida again, this is where Trump is actually finding himself ahead in many polls like Trafalgar, which was the most accurate in 2016, actually ahead in Miami-Dade County. So the Biden administration takes for granted people who are in minorities at its peril. And I think that's the first thing it would need to address when it gets in to address that.
Rima, I was reading today that Mike Pence has been campaigning in Ohio, which suggests it could be more the way Amanda was suggesting, that maybe it won't be as narrow as we think. But what if it is Biden, what do you think his top priority should be, given the divisions in the country and all those things that we sometimes wrap together as the culture war?
I think it's healthcare, in my mind. I think that's the biggest thing that needs to be addressed. Whether that's simply dealing with the pandemic or equalizing insurance or healthcare for everybody, dare I say universal healthcare system. But I think that, Bart talked about racism. Racism doesn't just stem from Joe Biden. It stems from most white people in this country, and it has for many years. And healthcare would be one angle where you could start to level it out.
Andrew, Biden's priorities if he were to be elected. Andrew, can you hear us?
Yeah, COVID. It's got to be COVID. So that is the number one priority. We need a coherent, integrated federal response, because without a solution to the COVID problem, the economy is doomed. And there won't be money for anything else. You can't. I think Rima's absolutely right. The healthcare is a real issue, but without the economy humming along, you can't pay for all the other things that Biden wants to do. So sort COVID out, get the economy back on its feet, and then he has options.
Amanda?
I agree that I think healthcare and COVID have to be the main things. I also do wish that Joe Biden would be more open about the fact that he has recovered from stuttering. And that's the main reason that he often looks for a word, because he realizes he's going to get caught up on a word. It has nothing to do with the mental state, but has to do with something that he has overcome. And I think that's something that if he were open about that, I think that also would win him a few more votes. But COVID and healthcare.
I wondered if any of you think it likely that the Democrats would take the Senate, and what the implications of that would be. What do you think, Amanda? Do you think it's obviously possible, but is it likely that they could do that on the coattails of Biden if some of the polls are right? Who knows?
I think there are so many things that, again, 46 million people have already voted. So in some ways, some sort of the last now down to 12 days, it is possible. Whether it's likely or not, I mean, those races are so dependent on so many different factors. The North Carolina race has been shaken up a little bit. South Carolina has been going back and forth. So it's probably not likely and certainly wouldn't get a 60 majority anyway. But it's certainly a possibility. And if that does happen, then Biden would be able to move forward with policies and with programs that actually do benefit the American people, instead of getting hung up on endless debates back and forth, as is happening with the financial support bill that is currently not going anywhere.
Bart, maybe just a brief answer on whether you think the Democrats could take the Senate, but a more interesting answer perhaps would be, or interesting question, would be whether you think some Republicans will be somewhat subtle, but will put distance between themselves and the president because they're fighting their own race and they may think he's not going to win his.
Yeah, I think that's what everyone's expecting the Republican Party to do after 2016. Very few people thought Trump would win. I think even Trump himself wasn't expecting a victory, to be honest. But if you look at the Senate race in Michigan, I think there are some clues for us in how this will fare. I think it was Siena and the New York Times did a very interesting poll on the 12th of October across Michigan on the president and the Senate race the same day. And the poll showed that Joe Biden was 7 points ahead. But interestingly, if you look at the Senate race, where there's a very charismatic young man called John James, who's a military veteran, Apache helicopter pilot, and also an African-American running against a career politician, Democrat. Fine, he's actually one of the more productive members of the Senate, but he was 1 point behind. So I think there are clues there into the willingness of people polled to admit that they're voting for the president. And then going back to my point about Biden's priorities in if he was elected, race again. John James is African-American. I think there's a lot less social stigma if you admit voting for a Black Republican over President Trump. So that poll was taken on the same day by New York Times. Yeah.
Rima, what do you think of this? The chances of Democrats taking the Senate and also Republicans, Senate candidates, distancing themselves from the president?
I think I'm more with Amanda. I think it would be nice, but it's unlikely. I think in some of the key states where Democrats are running against Republicans, I come back to voter suppression and whether those states actually make it easy for people, and maybe especially lots of people of color who would be voting Democrat. So that's all I'll say on that. And I'm sorry, Gavin. The second question was.
Well, let's move on to Andrew very quickly because we've only got a couple of minutes. And I was just going to say, Andrew, the reason I went on about the Senate was I know as a DC resident, the District of Columbia resident for many years, the House of Representatives said we're statehood for DC, which would give them 2 extra seats, but of course it'd have to get through the Senate. So it wouldn't just be something that if the Democrats were to take the Senate, it wouldn't be just something that would be a problem for the Republicans for a few years. It could be a problem for Republicans for many years to come. I just wonder what you think of that area, what the chances are of Democrats picking up some seats.
I think they will, but 2 or 3 months ago, I thought the Republicans would keep control of the Senate. Now looking at some of these really close races, they could flip in the Democrats' favor. It could be a slight Democratic majority. Obviously, that would make their life in Washington much easier if they had control of the White House, the House, and the Senate. But they're not going to get to the super majority of 60. But they can still do a lot with unified control of all the branches of government. I mean, you flag the DC issue. There's also Puerto Rico as well, potentially. Mm-hmm. There are more states out there, more potential Democratic states out there. Again, I don't know whether Biden would have, I don't think he would have the power to bring in more states. I don't know. I mean, you can imagine the constitutional fight over that. It would mm-hmm. be bloody.
Mm-hmm. And he's got other things, if he is elected, to contend with. Could I ask you all just for a one-word answer? Who's going to win? Amanda?
Biden.
Andrew? Biden. Rima?
Biden.
Bart?
Trump. We laughed last time.
I know, we laughed last time and you were right. Anyway, we shall see. And we shall see, some of us at least, who'll be staying up for the debate tonight. I'd like to thank all of you, actually. What a great panel, a great discussion, some superb questions. Thank you, Boyan, for channeling those from Brussels and to your audience there. But in particular, let me thank Andrew, Amanda, Rima, and Bart. And thank all of you, the couple of hundred of you who've been tuning in throughout this. Thank you for watching. And
Thank you.
Thank you.
Thank you, Gavin.